Welcome to this presentation on Living History Threads. The identity of our students, who they see themselves as, who they identify with, is probably shaped more by what happens in our history classes than in any of the other subjects that we teach. And so, if we're fine with our students seeing themselves as Americans, citizens of the United States, and impressed, proud of our military superiority, partial to Republicans, and having heroes like George Washington and Robert E. Lee, then the curriculums that are provided by the evangelicals will serve us just fine. On the other hand, if what we want to communicate, what we want to see developed in our students is for them to understand that followers of Jesus are foremost, members of the kingdom of God. And seeing Christians in Iraq and Afghanistan and Thailand, seeing them as family, our family. We belong to them. If we're interested in having people like Michael Sattler and Polycarp and Annie Funk as influential for our children, then we're going to have to take a different path. Living History Threads is an effort, is an attempt to chart a different course in history education for grades 1 to 4. And that's what we want to spend some time talking about today. We're going to spend some time looking at the reasons why we put this curriculum together. We're going to look at the beliefs that undergird the curriculum. We're going to also look at the characteristics that make this curriculum unique. And then we want to just dive into the nuts and bolts and take something of a tour of the curriculum. I'm Stephen Brubaker. I've been involved in this project since the beginning. And helping me here today with the presentation will be Patrick Heatwell, and then later Esther Bean. Patrick, you've done a lot of work in terms of philosophy of history, and so I'm wondering if you could just spend a little time talking to us here about what some of those beliefs are behind the program.
Sure. Many of our beliefs about history, the beliefs that went into building this curriculum, many of them revolve around a question that's both simple but often scary when our students ask us. And they say something like this: why do we have to learn this? History may seem like the perfect subject to question because at the surface it doesn't seem to have a lot of practical application. It is a really good question. Why study the past? How does the study of George Washington and the Wright brothers and Minna Simons, how does the study of these folks help prepare our students to be productive members of society and of God's heavenly kingdom? And to begin answering that question, what I'd like to do is tell you a story about a cousin of mine who was a firefighter. He was a firefighter in a large urban city, and he told me the story of how one night the call came, the alarm came in the fire, and he went downstairs. I guess he rushed. I guess that's what firefighters do. And they jumped in the truck and they started heading out in the city. But something was wrong. The man driving the truck was just easing along. He wasn't rushing to the fire like firefighters are supposed to. And then my cousin told me that all at once, the driver sort of shook himself and then just hammered down on the throttle. Now, what caused him to change his behavior all of a sudden? Well, two things really. One is he woke up. He was sleep driving. That's scary to think about. Second of all, once he woke up, he realized who he was. He realized, I'm a firefighter. And since I'm a firefighter, I will act in firefighter ways. I will drive this truck out of my identity as a firefighter. When he understood his identity, his actions followed. And maybe you've had a parent tell you something like this as you left to go on a date or maybe to Bible school. They said, remember who you are. What did they mean by that? They meant something about, they wanted you to think about your identity in such a way that would produce actions, so that when you were away from home and you remembered who you were, you acted in a certain way. If identity is so important, how do we get that in our students? How do we get our students to think about who they are? And God actually answers that question in Deuteronomy chapter 6, when he says this. He says, "When your son asketh thee in time to come, saying, What mean the testimonies and statutes and the judgments which the Lord our God hath commanded you?" Why do we do these things, Dad? What are these laws and these commandments? Now notice what God says. He says, "Then thou shalt say unto thy son," and tell him a story. Not a list of facts about God, not some theological structure, but he said, when your students ask, who are we and why do we act the way they do, you then tell them about Pharaoh, and you tell them about the things that have happened to us. And so one of the ways we remember who we are, one of the significant ways, is by telling the stories of God's faithfulness. And where else do we do that? But in history class. And so we believe that history presented in a story form serves as a powerful tool in developing our students' identity, their values, and their vision. And that's one of the reasons we use stories in living history as a way of presenting the content. Now, there are at least 3 parts to this identity that I want to talk about just briefly, and those are these. We want our students to identify who they are in relationship to a God, to our God. We want them to have an identity in relation to other Christian people, fellow citizens of God's kingdom, and also a relationship in terms of who they are in the big world that we live in, this big, diverse world. So first of all, as God's people, history class helps build identity in that our students learn that they serve a God who controls and directs history. God is in charge of history, and he's doing something in history. And as our students begin to understand this, then they also realize that God is in control of history. In Daniel, the Bible tells us that God even raises up rulers and puts rulers down. And this understanding that God is in charge and that he's in control brings trust, a sense of peace during troubled times, the sorts of times that we live in. But even more than that, it's not just that our students learn that, yes, my God is in charge and my God is in control, but it's that maybe I could be a part of what my God is doing. If he's in charge, he's doing something throughout time, and he's in control, then I actually can get involved in his work in the world and have some vision for that. And so we believe with confidence that God holds the ultimate power in controlling history, as well as a belief that students will develop an interest in what God is doing around the world. They'll become what we call world Christians, interested and involved in God's work around the world. So first, an identity in terms of who I am in relationship to God. But secondly, history class builds an identity as it helps students see who they are as citizens of God's kingdom, fellow citizens with other men and women. And this happens as our students hear the stories of other Christians who have lived for the Lord and served the Lord. We believe the stories of the past, repeated in many history texts, have wrongly glorified those who have conquered with political power at the exclusion of telling of those who lived and died for God's heavenly kingdom. Instead of mainly hearing of warriors and political leaders, we want our students to hear stories of those who conquered good with evil, who served God against all the odds, and who advanced the kingdom of heaven. We want a history not only of George Washington, of Hannibal, of Dwight Eisenhower, but also a history of Felix Manz, Elizabeth Elliot, and John Troyer. So, who am I in terms of a relationship to God? Who am I in terms of a relationship to fellow citizens? I can be like that. I can be like those people in history. And finally, we want our students to develop an identity in terms of who they are in relation to a big world, a big diverse world out there. Do our students look compassionately on those around them and want to share the love of Jesus with them? How do our students respond to new Latino or Asian immigrants that move into our communities, or to the struggles of urban African American communities? We believe an understanding of history equips kingdom citizens for more effective love and service by developing understanding and compassion for their world. You know, we love others best when we understand them? And where do we go about learning and understanding about those around us if it's not in history class? Why study history? We study history because history class offers a unique place in the school to learn how to follow the greatest command, to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And our vision is that our students could be like that firefighter, that they realize who they are. Wow, I'm one of God's, and I'm a part of a family that stretches all around the globe of kingdom citizens. But I'm also a part of a global community, a big diverse world that needs to become a part of my family. And that all of them grasping this understanding could then have the fuel to be enthusiastic about being involved in God's work all around the world.
So how do we take those beliefs and turn that into something of a curriculum? I plan to offer 6 of the characteristics of Living History Threads that begins to flesh out what is unique about this curriculum. The first characteristic would be living books and stories, and these form the principal way that the content is given to the students. It's, you might say, the textbooks of the course. Living History does not have a traditional textbook, but it does have a lot of living books and stories. For level 3-4, here is the stack of living books, and there is the listing of books that are included on that level. By living books, we mean those stories and books that you just really enjoy looking at, reading, and coming back to over and over again. The historian Barbara Tuchman asked this question: how can history be taught in interesting and engaging ways? And she answers by saying, tell stories. And so we have read thousands upon thousands of books and stories, trying to pull out the ones that do the best job of telling the story of history for our 1st through 4th grade students. A second characteristic, read alouds. The way that the content or the living books are delivered is by the teacher reading aloud to their student. This really does form the basis for how living history is taught. A lot of the class time is spent with the teacher reading to their student. Now, some people have said, but is that really a good way to use class time? And we know there are a variety of benefits for the reading aloud, and let me just offer 3. First of all, when a teacher reads aloud to their class, it allows them to have a higher level of vocabulary and reading than if the books all had to be on level for the child. A second benefit is that by reading aloud, we really are cultivating listening skills in our students. And I know over the years I've noticed on achievement test scores for Mennonite schools that this is a place that we tend to be weak in. But perhaps the most significant benefit of the reading aloud is that it makes learning, it makes discovery a shared community experience. The joy of that is something that you can experience, not just the child with their book, but the child with their classmates and with their teacher. They come, this is neat. They can get excited together. And so we really see that as a very significant part of what happens here in the read alouds. A third characteristic is that we include formative stories along with informative stories. By informative stories, we mean those stories that we tell in order for our students to be culturally literate. There are some terms, people, events that we want our children to know. So we want them to know about Alexander the Great, for example. We want them to be informed of that. But we don't necessarily want Alexander the Great to be formative for our students. And so along with these informative stories, we mix formative stories, stories of people that we want to shape the character and imaginations and loves of our students. So we mix those together here in the program. A fourth characteristic is that instead of having one branch of history for each grade level, we actually integrate a variety. And so you see we have world history, American history, church history, Anabaptist history, local history, geography. All of these strands are integrated at each grade level. One of the things that this does is it anchors all stories in the bigger story of what God is doing in the world, not just in a nation story. Another thing that's significant here is that we're putting church and Mennonite history into the program at the very earliest levels. I've taught junior high Mennonite history a number of times, and it was always so frustrating because students came into this completely cold. It was like teaching Chinese history. The terms, the names, the events, they were just unknown. And what we find is that when students are exposed to Michael Sattler and Minna Simons and Conrad Grebel in the early grades, by the time they get into junior high, the familiarity doesn't breed contempt. It breeds appreciation. A fifth characteristic of living history is that we've worked hard to identify the key content. What is it that first graders ought to know about world history? What is it they ought to know about geography? What is it that they ought to know about Mennonite history? And we've put that in there and focused on that in the program. And maybe I'll just stop for a moment here and talk why we call it threads. We spent a lot of time trying to name this curriculum. And at one point in our work, we had dreams of having a grade 1 to 12 program. And so in our discussions about philosophy and how we wanted this to look and so on, we followed something of the classical model where in the lower grades is where you really work hard at giving the grammar of a subject, the nuts and bolts of the subject, the information, the data. And so we called that the threads of history. But then with time, you need to have that data working together, wrestling and coming together. And so we thought that if we would extend this program in grades 5 to 8, we would call that weavings, having the information of history coming together. And then if we extended it on 9 through 12, we would call it tapestry. So as we become familiar with how the threads actually fit, we can begin to see the larger picture of what God is doing in the world. This would be an example of the key content for one of the units in level 3. So you see we've identified the names and places, events of some things that we want the students to know, and as well as giving just a short definition description of what it is that the student ought to know about those things. The sixth and final characteristic that I want to talk about would be maps and timelines. And this curriculum uses maps and timelines a lot. We're convinced that if our students are really going to be able to make sense out of history, they're going to need to be able to take every event and person and have an idea of where it fits in space and time. And so we're going to use maps to constantly be reinforcing where in space this takes place. And we're going to use timelines on a regular, daily basis in order to place where in time a particular event is taking place as well. So we have student maps, in addition, a classroom timeline that we try to keep very simple so that there's not too much information, but where with time, over the 4 years of their training, they begin to get this grid from creation to the present and a few markers where all events, people, and places can be put. 6 characteristics that give something of the uniqueness of living history. Now I want us to dig a little deeper. Esther deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the existence of living history threads. Some of us have a lot of ideas and theory and philosophy. Esther is the first one of the writers that we asked to take these ideas and actually flesh it out. And so we're very, very grateful for her work. Esther got on board with the philosophy, with the ideas very, very quickly. And she probably understands the underpinnings, the inner workings of living history like no one else. And so, Esther, what I'd like for you to do is if you give us something of an overview of the structure, how living history actually works.
Let's walk through the scope and sequence for grades 1 to 4. First of all, we need to understand the levels. We often talk about levels instead of grades. So we'll talk about level 1, 2, 2, 1, 3, 4, and 4, 3. A student in grade 1, if you have classes where each grade is taught separately, a student in grade 1 will start with level 1, 2, grade 2 will be in level 2, 1, grade 3, level 3, 4. However, in a multi-grade setting, which is how a lot of us teach, grade 1 and 2 can work together on either level 1, 2 or 2, 1. And it doesn't matter which level they start with. There's no difference in the rigor of that. For levels 3, 4, and 4, 3, that's intended for grades 3 and 4. So it's especially designed to accommodate multi-grade classrooms. How much time does this take in the schedule? For levels 1, 2, and 2, 1, we've designed it to be run for half a year, and that's 3 days a week, 30 minutes a class session. For levels 3, 4, and 4, 3, it's designed to be done for an entire year, and that's running it 4 times a week for 40 minutes a class period. So it's a little bit longer for grades 3 and 4. Stephen has mentioned the 6 strands that comprise the curriculum. On the left, you'll be able to see the strands listed and the corresponding units. For a few of the strands, like local history, there's just 1 unit to go with it. For some of the other levels, for some of the other strands, there are 6 or 7 units to go with that, depending on that. However, the course of study is not designed to be done according to strand. Instead, we've taken the units for each year and arranged them in chronological order so that the students will be able to understand that unit's place in time a little bit easier. These are the units listed by level 1, 2, and 2, 1, and you're able to see the listing of the number of lessons along the side too. The average unit on this level is about 3 days, so about 1 week per unit. In level 3, 4, and 4, 3, the units are a little bit longer, ranging from 1 week to 3 weeks of study on a particular unit. What is a typical lesson like? First of all, we start out with mastering the facts, which is a quick review of key content that has been learned, and also learning geography. We sing songs to help us learn geography. This is especially in grade 3 and 4 that we're working with this sort of schedule. There's a quick opening to get the students ready to learn the key content for the day, but then the bulk of the time is spent reading the story. You'll spend 20 to 30 minutes reading that story and interacting with it. At the end, there's a little wrap-up time, often discussion about the key content that was learned, or else maybe themes that have come out of that story, like non-resistance or discrimination or things like that. That's what a typical lesson looks like.
As a teacher, I know that when I really get excited about a curriculum is when I can see the stuff, get my hands on the materials. And so, Esther, would you take us on a tour?
Sure. There's a teacher's guide to go with each level. This is the grade 3 and 4 level, and I'd like to just show you a little bit what it is like. Let's have a look at a sample unit, the Renaissance unit. For each unit, there's a unit background and overview that's written, which I find is very helpful because we have all these individual books, but we as teachers need to understand how they all fit together, or they just become individual stories. This can help with that. There's a listing of the key content for that unit, what materials you need, additional ideas of maybe bulletin board ideas, art ideas, devotional ideas, places to visit, websites to check out, things like that. Additional resources as well. For each lesson then, for each day, there's a one-page lesson guide that goes with it, helping you to prepare for the lesson, listing some objectives, things that we've identified as objectives for the lesson. Yours might change a little. Materials, some ideas for introducing the lesson, and then a section also giving additional information about the lesson, about the book that you're reading, or ideas to discuss with the students. At the end of the unit then are where you'll find review sheets, tests, extra chants, and a glossary. Because if we're reading books and spending a lot of time with that, we need to read accurately. That's a teacher's guide. The favorite part of the curriculum, though, is the books. Books like Henry's Freedom Box, or The Enduring Word with manuscripts, pictures of manuscripts, or Imprisoned for Christ, a story about Richard Wurmbrand, who spent years in prison, or A Story of the Pony Express, or A Hero in the Holocaust. Along with the read-alouds, we also have some student booklets. We've done them up only for the church and Anabaptist units, one for grade 1 and one for grade 2, and several for grade 3, and several for grade 4 as well. And these are full-color booklets that each student has a copy of, sometimes with timelines, maps, other pictures to go with it. So the teacher reads the text, the student follows along, and sometimes over the period of several days, they'll be reading them. And then the students take these home at the end of the time so that they can keep these. In grade 3 and 4, we also do a local history study where they research the history of their church. So this is their little research booklet that they do. There's a spot for maps, timelines. They design a timeline for their church. They write up stories that they've learned by researching and interviewing a church leader who can tell them some of the history stories, identifying what missions they are associating with and support. They also do a community study, so they research the history of their community that they live in grade 4. Maps and timelines are so important to the curriculum as well. And sometimes it's really hard to get good maps of ancient times. So we've put together some maps of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ones like that. And I have some posted over at the side there that you can take a look at there. And grade 1 and 2, there are flashcards to go with the different units to help with key content. The flashcards and the pictures are often used in teaching, but they're especially used for review. So there's a picture on one side with the name for grade 1 and 2 and a definition on the back. Christopher Dock, school teacher at Skippick School, and there's a motion that goes with it to bring in kinesthetic ideas for reinforcing this. So there's a stack of those, and I have some posted over on the side there as well. In grade 3 and 4, we have larger pictures, quite a stack of them for grade 3 and for grade 4. I have some of them posted over at the side and at the back there too. Some like Sir Walter Raleigh, William the Conqueror from the Bayeux Tapestry. We've tried to get especially paintings and tried to get the most authentic things that we can for this. Archimedes, the Parthenon, John Hancock, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, to help in reviewing some of those ideas. Those are a few of the ideas for you.
Thank you, Esther. Esther is Canadian, and so I have a question for you. This clearly is a program written for American schools. We have a number of American history units built in here. Does this mean that a Canadian school should not use this program?
No, I don't think so. I think that a student in school should learn the history of his own country before he learns that of another country. So I would suggest accommodations for that. There are a few of the American units that I'd suggest pulling and substituting some Canadian studies for it. Although there's a lot of American history that also profoundly affects Canadian history as well. So no, I think with a few accommodations, they can easily use it.
And I believe you have some recommendations as to which units to drop out
Sure.
and what to supplement it with. And if they were interested in that, could they
I'd be happy to talk to them.
Okay, very good.
This concludes the live presentation of Living History Threads. We appreciate your interest in this curriculum and welcome your questions. For further information, please contact Christian Learning Resource.